Thought I was done with beading projects, but here we go again. I don't know about you, but I find that all the clothes that brands are making these days are incredibly boring. Like, no patterns, no design details, boxy silhouettes, incredibly depressing grayish color palettes. And so I just don't really buy clothes anymore because I don't like what I see. And if I do like what I see, I probably can't afford it. Now I would just make all my clothes, but the problem with that is that I'm self-employed and it's really hard to justify spending time on something just for myself and not for my business. It makes me feel very guilty. At the end of last year, I had a holiday party to go to and I really wanted to wear something new. I couldn't find anything to buy. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna make a dress, I'm gonna film it, I'm gonna put it on YouTube, and then I won't feel guilty about spending all this time on it. But the problem with that is that it slows down the making process so much because you gotta set up the camera, you know, do all this other stuff. You can't just make the thing. And then as a consequence of that, I was sewing up until the very last minute of the party. I was literally like hand sewing and then jumping in the cab and going to the party that I was wearing the dress to. And then the holidays happened and time got away from me. So all these months later, I finally edited the footage, and I'm pleased to share with you the process of me making last year's holiday dress. My inspiration for this dress is Jen's Pirate Booty Odyssey mini dress from Free People. I've been eyeing this dress for a while, but the price is so out of reach right now, I just need to accept that it's unrealistic and just make something similar for myself. Given the amount of time I have to sew this and the limitations of my patience, I want to pick out the key elements that I love about this dress and also decide what I don't like about it or what I want to eliminate for my version. For me, it's all about the texture and drape. The amount of beads on this dress gives the fabric, which in its natural state is pretty flowy and airy, a lot of weight, which allows it to hang and cling to the body in a really flattering way. There's also a lot of gathering in this dress, which gives it an easiness and kind of a romantic feel. The sleeves are also key as they really make a statement and add a lot of drama. Some things I don't like about this dress are the really high slit in the front, which seems pointless and kind of makes the dress look more like a tunic to me, and also the shirring in the back. I think shirring looks really casual on dresses, and in this instance disrupts the drape of the dress in a really jarring way. I also think for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to eliminate the cummerbund panel around the waist and have the seam sit at my natural waistline. Looking closely at the details, I can see that while the bodice and skirt are lined, the sleeves are unlined. That's great, it will save me some time not having to line the sleeves. These beads are sewn directly into the fabric, and I really don't have time for that, so I'm going to find a beaded trim that I can sew on instead. When it comes to designing a dress pattern from scratch, there are a few different ways to do it. One of the quicker ways to do it is to carefully trace a dress that you already have that has a similar fit to the one you're trying to make. I didn't really have a close match to the dress I'm making in my closet, but I thought this one would do as it's gathered at the waist and doesn't have any fit lines in the bodice or skirt such as darts. Of course, my dress will have a completely different neckline and longer shoulder seams, but these are things I feel confident in eyeballing and drafting by hand. I'm stretching the elastic around the waist until the fabric is flat with no gathers so I can measure the waistline. I like the amount of gathers this dress has, and I know it fits me comfortably, so this will be a good reference point for my dress. As I'm drafting, I'm remeasuring myself where the important points of the pattern will hit, like the V of the neckline and the shoulder seam. A lot of pattern drafting is smoothing out lines and redrawing anything that doesn't look right. The skirt will basically be a rectangle. The gathering at the waist will do the work of shaping the silhouette when it's all sewn together. Whenever you're drafting a pattern with gathering, it's a good idea to create equally spaced notches along the gathering line to help you distribute the gathers evenly when you sew your garment. I'm going to use the front bodice pattern as the basis for the back bodice pattern, making the armholes slightly shallower and redrawing the neckline. I'm using 1/2 inch seam allowance for my patterns. For the sleeve, I'm going to use a pattern for a balloon sleeve I made in my online course Stitchcraft, which I link below in the description. I need to measure the front and back armholes on my bodice so I can plan how much gathering will go into the sleeve pattern. The modifications I'm going to make to my sleeve pattern are to drop the armhole, extend the sleeve length so there's more pooling of fabric at the wrist, and widening the overall sleeve while still keeping in mind that it needs to fit within the width of my fabric. Before I cut the pattern in my final fabric, I'm going to make a mock-up in muslin. This isn't bad for a first fit. The most obvious issue is that the measurement around the bust is too small, so I'll need to add a wedge shape to the pattern to widen it, basically filling in the space you see here. I also want to drop the waist so it sits more at my natural waistline. This will also drop the hem a bit. The sleeve looks a lot poofier in the muslin than it will in the chiffon, so I'm trying to keep that in mind as I assess the shape. The shoulder seam is sitting a little further back than it should, so I marked where the new seam line should be. This is something I love about making mock-ups in natural muslin. You can write new seam lines and measurements right on it. After adjusting my patterns, I can cut them in my final fabric. For this dress, I need a sheer flowy fabric for the shell and a more opaque yet still flowy fabric for the lining. Whenever possible, I try to use dead stock, organic, or upcycled fabrics for my projects. The fabric I ultimately chose is a dead stock peachy pink chiffon from the New Craft House, which is an independent, women-owned business that only sells dead stock materials, which means they were surplus from ateliers or factories and would have otherwise ended up in a landfill. If you're in the UK, I highly recommend using the New Craft House for your sustainable sewing projects. The lining I got isn't a perfect match, but I think it will still look nice overlaid with the sheer fabric. Much harder than finding the fabric was finding a beaded trim that I liked. Most beaded trims are designed to be sewn into seams, so they're attached to a ribbon, but my trim would be sewn onto the fabric and I really didn't want the ribbon to be the main focus. I settled on this trim from Etsy because it looked like I could trim away the excess ribbon without the beading falling off. By the way, if any of my materials are still available at the time of this posting, I'll link to them in the description. Slippery fabrics like chiffon are notoriously difficult to cut without them moving. I recommend really taking your time to line up the selvage edges and making sure the grain is straight with a nice flat folded edge, then putting weights on it to make sure it doesn't shift as you cut your patterns. Remember to always check that your grain line is parallel or perpendicular to your selvage edge. Instead of pins, which can shift the fabric, I'm using really professional pattern weights like candles and ceramic donuts to hold my pattern down. The best way to cut this fabric would be to use a rotary cutter, but I don't have a cutting mat big enough, so I'm just taking it slow and steady with the scissors. For the lining, I only needed to cut out 4 pieces, the front and back bodice and the front and back skirt. I don't want the skirt lining to peek out below the outer shell, so instead of drafting a shorter skirt pattern, I'm just going to shift the original pattern up a bit and recut the hem of the skirt. This is me literally cutting corners to finish this dress on time. Before I sew the pattern pieces together, I want to attach the beaded trim so the raw ends will be hidden in the seams. I'm using a piece of string to plan the design and layout of the beads before committing to cutting the trim into specific lengths. I'm drawing the trim layout directly onto my patterns, both so that I can replicate it if I ever make this dress again, and also so that I can be consistent and symmetrical with the design. Before I sew on the trim, I'm trying a little experiment to see if I can trim away excess ribbon and get my presser foot close to the beads when I sew it. I'm using an overlock foot, which is a skinnier presser foot, and my machine's overlock stitch, which is a pattern of straight stitches and zigzag stitches. I also moved my needle all the way to the right so I could get the presser foot as close as possible. I'm actually fairly happy with that. It's going to be a slow process, but still faster than hand sewing. I'm putting a little tape on the ends, which I'll remove later to make sure the beads don't come off as I'm working. Whenever you're sewing a trim like this onto a delicate fabric, there's a strong possibility that the pattern piece will shrink a bit around your stitch line. It's not such a big deal given the loose silhouette of this piece, but if I needed to be more careful of that, I would use a tearaway or water-soluble interfacing to stabilize the chiffon. For any exposed seam, I'm pressing the seams open and then enclosing them in some dead stock satin silk bias tape that I happen to have on hand. Again, not a perfect color match, but pink is pink. When you're figuring out the order of which seams to sew, you need to consider what the final seam you finish with will be. So in the case of a skirt, my final seams will be the hem, which will be double folded, and the waist, which will be encased in a channel for my drawstring. That means I should sew the skirt side seams first because the raw ends can be hidden in these seams. With both skirts sewn, I can attach them at the waistline with a basting stitch. This is a straight stitch set to the longest setting on my machine, which I'll also use to pull and gather the material. Instead of an elastic, I'm going to use a drawstring to gather the waist. When the skirts are sewn into the bodice, I'll press the seam allowances up and sew a channel around the waistline. Here I'm marking 2 buttonholes above the bodice seam allowance, which will be the entrances for my drawstring. In this case, I am using a tearaway interfacing to help prevent bunching of the chiffon. For the bodice shell and lining, I'm going to sew shoulder and side seams, then put the lining over the bodice, right sides together, and sew them together at the neckline. To get a crisp V on your neckline, you need to clip into the V as close to the stitch line as you dare, without touching the stitches. I'm also trimming away some of the seam allowance around the neckline to reduce bulk, ironing the seams towards the lining, and then stitching very close to the neckline seam on the lining side to create an understitch, which helps the neckline lay correctly with less lining peeking to the front. I press the seam allowance of the hem of the lining up because it will eventually form a sandwich that encases the raw edges of the skirts, and it's easier to iron at this stage. I folded and pressed the seam allowance of the lining armholes as well. To gather the sleeve hem, I just sewed a double fold to create a channel, but left a gap in the top stitching to create an entrance for my elastic. When you're inserting an elastic this way, it's helpful to mark at each end on one side so you know that it hasn't gotten twisted as you push it through. I'm using a circular knitting needle to push my elastic through, which worked pretty well. I also am not going to trim the elastic to the correct length until I've gotten it all the way through and pinned it so it won't snap back into the channel, as I need to sew the 2 ends together before I seal it up. Next, I'm setting the sleeve into the outer bodice with the bodice inside out and the fabric right sides together. I sewed a basting stitch along the upper armhole of the sleeve so I can create some gathers. There's no need to finish this raw edge because it will be hidden in the bodice lining as a last step. Now I'm attaching the skirts to the outer bodice at the waist, pulling the basting stitches on the skirts to create evenly distributed gathers and making sure that center front, center back, and the side seams match up. It was after this step that I started to panic that I wouldn't finish the dress in time for the party, so I unfortunately have no footage of me hand sewing the lining armholes to the sleeve or creating the channel and drawstring for the waist, but know that both of those things did happen and I did finish the dress. I'm thrilled with how this came out. I think it's more flattering on me than the Free People dress would have been, and obviously it's a custom fit. I hope this inspires you to experiment and make your own clothes and not to settle for what you can find in stores. If you want to learn more technically how to sew or pattern draft, I have structured, take at your own pace online courses available through Skillshare. If you aren't already on Skillshare, the link in the description will take you to a free trial where you can get unlimited access to my classes and thousands of others. So until next time, keep in touch and happy sewing!